lots of candles, plenty of cake, and she'll be ready for your calls, tweets, and emails starting at noon Eastern on Book TV's In Depth on C-SPAN 2. Herb Boyd delivers a response to the late Manning Marable's biography, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, which was published in 2011 and nominated for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. Mr. Boyd presents the collected thoughts of over 30 African-American scholars who examine Mr. Marable's depiction of Malcolm X. It's about 2 hours, next on Book TV.
Herb Boyd is an award-winning author and journalist. He has published 22 books and many, many articles at the national and international level. I'm not going to give you a litany. I will tell you he has a website. You can go on it and find it out for yourself. But I will say to you that he has been associated with a series of unbowed people pushing the envelope, trying to get messages not only across to the people who are our opposition, but people on our side, to get bone, to get courage, to get the desire to move forward. And in that particular motif is Malcolm X, who rises literally like a beacon. And any of you who were around New York in the 60s, you have your own stories. And when we started listening or hearing about the Marable book, which we thought we should bring forward because in the, well, just in terms of intellectual honesty, you don't ignore what somebody is saying, whether you like it or don't like it. You become knowledgeable about it and then you refute it. But then we were glad to hear that Herb Boyd and a series of other people had written a response. And with that, I am going to now introduce you to Herb Boyd with a response.
Thank you. Right. Do not speak to me of martyrdom, of men who died to be remembered on some parish day. I don't believe in dying, though I too will die. And like the flowers, the violets, like castanets, they will echo me. Yet this man, this genius, the one who has cheered us forward, thick-lipped with words, will no longer speak again. Those words, the opening stanzas that Sonia Sanchez wrote back in 1968 in a book called For Malcolm that was edited by the late Dudley Randall and Margaret Burroughs. Dudley Randall was the founder of Broadside Press in Detroit, Michigan, my hometown. I always like to say that Detroit, Muriel, is where my soul is, and New York is where my spirit is. Margaret Burroughs, she died 2 years ago. She was a founder of the DuSable Museum, one of the outstanding museums in this country. Dudley died in the year 2000, and I always remember him as a mentor, and his most famous poem is about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You know, it seems to me, says Booker T, I don't agree, says W.E.B. Pretty much summarized the kind of tension between those two individuals. But he was an outstanding poet, a word warrior of the highest order, and the founder of Broadside Press. And if you want to get more on him, there's a very fine documentary out there called The Black Unicorn that you can get, a very fine work. I say that poem because it's also a poem that we utilize at the beginning of By Any Means Necessary, because it sets a certain kind of tone for us. I do believe that the whole spirit of Malcolm and what he represented during his short tenure, and you say 39 years, is very brief, exceedingly brief, particularly when you get as old as, well, anyway. Since I've been here so long, some of my students think I knew Frederick Douglass, you know. First name basis, you know, with Abraham Lincoln, you know. Of course, Lincoln never invited me to the White House, Obama did. But anyway, it sets a certain kind of tone for us. And so we asked permission to use it again. So that's the opening poem in the book. And thereafter, Muriel, you have just a flood of information coming about in it's kind of critical conversations. You'll notice the title is By Any Means Necessary, but it also has the subtitle, Malcolm X Real, Not Reinvented. And of course, the impetus on that word, reinvented. And many of the contributors, there's 35 contributors in this book. And just to contextualize it a bit, it really goes back to, it actually goes back to 1968 when you start talking about how these responses are gathered by African American public intellectuals and scholars and activists. William Styron put a book out then called The Confessions of Nat Turner. And it caused quite an uproar in a similar fashion to what Manning has done here with this book among black intellectuals and thinkers. And Dr. John Henry Clark, my mentor, brought together a number of respondents. And the book was called 10 Black Writers Respond to William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner. So in other words, some precedent had been established in terms of reacting to stuff out there. Of course, this was by no means the first time, but it's certainly a collective, the first time you had a solid collective of African American writers, you know, Muriel, to respond to a particular book out there they considered to be absolutely demeaning, reprehensible, and particularly in terms of meditations on history is what Styron called it. And we call it messing with our history, as he did. Even though at the time he was doing the book, you know, James Baldwin, one of my heroes, was in residence with him temporarily. And he eventually, ultimately endorsed the book. But we'll talk about that later, particularly James Baldwin. And so after that, 2 years ago, pretty much about the same time of year we are going through right now, I think it was pretty much moving into the spring of 2010, and Henry Louis Gates, he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times. It was called Ending the Slavery Blame Game, in which he said that almost 90%, you know, of the slaves, you know, trafficked on the Atlantic, across the Atlantic Ocean was facilitated, you know, by the African chiefs and other Africans, which was an astonishing number for us. And I immediately wrote a response in terms of how he's shifting the blame around and pretty much taking the European traders, you know, from out from under the hammer. We were trying to smash him all the time on that, but he said, no, you know, the Africans was complicit in this. But we're always concerned about to what extent they were complicit in terms of receiving, you know, the benefits of that. And of course, subsequently, when you move into the dark days of the plantation and slavery in this country, we know full well who the beneficiaries were. But nonetheless, after that letter to the editor that I wrote to the New York Times, a number of people called me up, and so I began to talk to people like Dr. Ron Daniels and Dr. Maulana Karenga and Dr. Haki Madhubuti. It's always good to surround yourself with all these doctors, huh? And we started a conversation on how we're going to respond to that. In other words, set the record straight. The problem with that is that there were really nothing that had been written. So you had to commission pieces, and therein lies the rub. So it never really got off the ground. And so Skip got away clean on that one. Although we had a number of conversations and a number of independent articles were done, but not in a collective way, the book we had planned to do, similar to what we've done here. So those are those two things, those two instances, going back to 1968, and then with Skip Gate 2 years ago, it gave us the kind of groundwork to move to this here one. Now, this is not my book. This is our book. I say our because I'm talking about those three men I just mentioned who were co-editors with me. In fact, it grew out of an event that we had at Mother Zion Church, in which we put together a conference there, a forum. And Ilyasa Shabazz and Rodnell Collins, who is the step-nephew of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, as well as James Small and Viola Plummer, Ron Daniels, and myself, and Imam Talib Abdul Rahim. Rashid were all a part of that particular panel. And then that's when I raised the question about we can take the product of this and be the core to begin to assemble some other responses out there. It was like 75 to 100 reviews came out on Manning Marable's book. So we plowed through all of them and decided which of the best of these, most representative, most reflective, at the same time trying to be even-handed about it all. And we chose 35 of these. I wanted to get a few more, but I couldn't get permission to use them. Or folks were somewhat reluctant to be a part of it. And even one of the writers, after they had decided to be a part of the project, wanted to back out because he saw the title and figured it was slanted in a particular way. It was skewed in a way that he couldn't live with. And then at last he decided to stay. When I showed him, I said, well, there's at least like 7 or 8 other people who share your position there. I wanted to have more women too, Muriel. I wanted to have more women, but you're looking at the 100 so reviews. If you can go to Abdullah Kalimat, who's one of the contributors, he has one of the best websites out there called Brother Malcolm. And you can go there and you can see all of the 100 reviews that he's compiled. And many of them are similar to what we have in the book here. So I say that this is our book. And it's the contributors, the 35 contributors that we have there, and their impressions, their critical conversations on how they really feel about this book. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that the money that we raised from this would go back to the family. We had that in mind from the start, that there would be no profit in at all for any of our contributors. Although they got free books, many of them were stunned to get 10 books. That is rare that a publisher would give you 10 books. That's like, that's 350 books right there that you've given away. And when you're struggling as a small publisher, that's a considerable whop, out of your budget. But nonetheless, we feel that this is an endeavor that is absolutely necessary, and we pushed ahead with it. We turned it around in 9 months. And that in itself is pretty remarkable, to get a book turned around that fast. Of course, it was published by Third World Publishing, and that's Haki's press. So I had like the ends with him right from the beginning, say, hey. But he was like really excited about the project, and he was amazed too that we was able to turn it around that fast, get permission from all of the 35 reviews that were out there that we wanted to use, and we pushed forward. And there is the product there. Now, I guess we should get to deconstructing the deconstructionists. Because Manning, and let me say this here from this top in terms of my feelings about Dr. Manning Marable, the late Dr. Manning Marable, who died April the 1st, and just 3 days before the book came out. And I think in my review, I talk about the kind of tragic irony, because it's a similar position that Malcolm experienced. He never had a chance to realize the fruits of his endeavor or to challenge, some of the people who had some concerns about what he had to say in the autobiography. And so, I was very much concerned about, making it sure that I was fair. I read the book twice before I wrote the review, make sure that I was moving in as fair and expeditious way as I could. And so what you have here is that a friend like Manning, I guess I'm uniquely in a position where being a member of the Nation of Islam when Malcolm was there, and then being a member of the Black Radical Congress when Manning Marable was there, I have a very unique, I don't think it's too many of us left who have that situation where we actually knew Malcolm and then knew Manning, and probably knew Manning much better than I knew Malcolm, because I was with Manning on many, many occasions as the communications director of the Black Radical Congress. So it was that association, and I just thought about that over the years. It's very, very rare that you have an opportunity to be just so blessed and in a privileged position to share that kind of evolution in our terms of our struggle to be on those fronts, that particular ramparts, with two very important people. And I say that with all due respect for Manning Marable, because for me, he was an outstanding scholar. You can say everything we've said about this book, and I think we have to be fair about that, but we have also to look at the kind of accumulation of his work. In particular, how capitalism underdeveloped Black America. I think is an astonishing piece of work, which kind of carries on what Walter Rodney had done with how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You know what I'm saying, Patrick? That was a continuation of that particular kind of methodology. Obviously using a Marxian analysis, very concerned about both race and class, and that was a thing that we all struggled about back in the 1960s, to try to find some common ground between, as they called it in those days, the narrow nationalists and the mechanical Marxists, and how you bridge in terms of what's the principal contradiction out there. Is it race or class, or is it necessary to see both of them in terms of having a holistic analysis about where we are, both socially, politically, and economically? So with Manning, and working with Manning over the years in the BRC, and then when he came, he bounced around. He was like peripatetic. He was all over the place. He spent 2 years at one institution and then moved on to another one. And I kind of see the similarities there. And then Malcolm he was like a real adventurer and moving all the time. If there's one thing I would like to focus on thematically, it would be his internationalism. I think that's one of the things that's often ignored. And we should give special attention to it. Of course, Spike Lee, did the best he could, with the film, but I thought it was somewhat lax when it came to looking at the last year and a half of his life, which is probably the most productive period. And it cries out for, a further discussion. And as Spike told me, Herb, do your own movie. So I said, it's not that easy, but maybe we can do a book. And so anyway, you have that kind of conjunction of Malcolm and Manning. 7 letters, huh? Manning, Malcolm, 7. But they have a number of other commonalities too. And I had a chance to share in all of the magnificence of their thoughts and ideas. So all of that is to say that there's some very valuable things in the book. And I think what Amiri Baraka said is that probably the best thing about Manning's book is that we resume a discussion about the life and legacy, the legend of Malcolm X, El-Hajj, Malik El-Shabazz. And what we've done is just a continuation of that discussion and that dialogue. And I'm sure that, and there's 2 or 3 other books that are in the pipeline. I hear Les Payne's book. Les has been working on his book for quite a while, so I look forward to seeing that. Jared Ball and Dr. Todd Burrows. Todd is one of our contributors in this book. They're working on their own response to Manning's book that'll be coming out by Black Classic Press. Paul Coates, a very good friend of ours, so I look forward to seeing that. But I think at last, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the most important thing is what the people have to say. So you'll have to, at some point, we hope that you can join the discussion. And of course, no investigation, no right to speak. You got to go ahead and come to grips with this information and join the dialogue. I think it's important. Two of the things, Muriel, that jump out at me, and which of course has been coming at a number of people, is the issue about the autobiography itself. And you always have to go back to what you call the points of origin. Where does any discussion begin? What propagates that, and then what's propagated, how is that perpetuated? Sometimes without any investigation from one researcher to another, and all they're doing is spreading the same kind of distortion and misinformation from another scholar without doing their homework. Currently, I'm working with Greg Reed, who for many years has been my friend in Detroit, and we're working on a biography of Alex Haley. And in doing the research there, we're making a number of discoveries about the relationship between Alex Haley and Malcolm X. 3 or 4 of the contributors in the book, they delve into that as well. And of course, Manning's position is that Alex was just not the right person for that project. In fact, it's the whole, in terms of the differing ideological and philosophical positions. And he ends up calling him a liberal Republican, which of course I don't know where he gets that from. I tried to research that too and find out where does this come in. Did somebody just say that at some point and thereby it's picked up and spread all over the place? But I'm not sure. I could not find that anywhere in doing all my research, and looking at the life of Alex Haley. But of course, it's just beginning. It's so much more to plow through because it's stacks and stacks. It's like 82 books of information that in Knoxville, Tennessee, down at the University of Tennessee, that I haven't had a chance to really go through. But nonetheless, you talk about this dismissal and then the whole deconstruction that he sets out to do. In fact, Manning says the real eye-opener came for him when he understood that he had to deconstruct the autobiography in order to kind of really launch his own research process. He had to destroy that, more or less, tear it apart, and see exactly, where the strengths and weaknesses were. So one of the things that I like to do is to think that, okay, you can deconstruct the autobiography, and of course, the autobiography is by no means a perfect book. I mean, there's a number of problems there. First of all, you talk about the relationship between someone who, Alex Haley, had been in the Coast Guard for 20 years, and to what extent he was in touch with kind of the vitality of the culture that Malcolm X had. He missed so many of the nuances and subtleties of what that conversation was all about. And you've had it being, the psychoanalytical probe of the relationship between the two of them. I think Victor Eugene Wolfenstein, he looks at it and sees that a psychoanalytic dialectic that was going on, that in effect that what Alex Haley was doing was analyzing him all along. But of course he did later on have Malcolm psychoanalyzed twice. And that's never brought up that much, but Greg Reed has all of the documents and information that pertains to that, and we'll be bringing that out in the book. Show and on both occasions, Malcolm wasn't even aware this was being done, that he was being psychoanalyzed, but he would leave little jottings behind on tissue paper or napkins and what have you, and then Alex would gather up this material, and in doing so, pass it on to these psychiatrists and psychologists, and so they could begin to do certain kind of studies, I guess from a graphology standpoint, as well as the doodling Like, what can these doodlings all about? So we can get to the bottom of it. But it became very important for Alex as he assembled the book itself. Beyond the autobiography, we have the kind of uproar that has come with the allegations, the assertions, the accusations of homosexuality, as well as the infidelities. Those are the two things that resonate mostly out there for readers who, haven't had the opportunity to get into the book, but they've heard those things and they want to know exactly what's going on with that. One of the things, again, is we say that if you have these particular kind of issues, you need to get to the bottom of them. Where does they start? So with the origins of the whole homosexuality, you look at it and we're talking about what Manning says is that what Malcolm does is that he changes the name in there and becomes Rudy, becomes the individual. Of course, you try to track that down too. Say, well, how do you know that he's changing, that this Rudy really doesn't exist? So at some point, though, when you have any kind of allegation out there, you have to substantiate it. Where's the evidence, So you have far too many instances in which he has just no evidence whatsoever. It's just remarkable that he was able to go along like that for so long without substantiating some of these very, very critical issues. You have to go ahead and ground it in some kind of sense of reality. But anyway, what happens is that you go back to the beginnings and discover that it's really something that originated possibly with Malcolm Shorty Jarvis. And this was Malcolm's friend for many years after, Malcolm had gone through his period of bouncing from Michigan to Boston, to Roxbury, and in the Roxbury-Boston section. This is when he encounters and begins to hang out with Malcolm Shorty Jarvis. In the film, that's Shorty is played by Spike Lee. And of course, Shorty takes exception to his characterization in that book. Of course, Malcolm Jarvis died in 1998, and it's amazing that a lot of this could have probably been really solved if they'd have gone to Malcolm and again interviewed him about that situation. It's amazing that on face value, so much that Manning Marable just took without further investigation. And he had an opportunity. The guy was around to 1998. In fact, he wrote his autobiography just a few months before his death. That book came out with an introduction by Cornel West, and I think co-edited by Paul Nichols, who worked with Malcolm Jarvis on the book. Nothing is ever said about William Paul Lennon, who is the man that supposedly Malcolm would sprinkle the talcum powder on and bring him to a sexual climax. So if that constitutes homosexuality, then it sounds like a masseuse to me, if anything. You sprinkle some talcum powder and rub somebody down. Hey, how does sex get into it? I guess the mere fact that he had an orgasm or a climax as a result of that, then that, that's a homosexual act. But anyway, Shorty Jarvis says nothing at all about this here in his autobiography, neither of the two books that he put out there. Nothing was said about that. So in other words, say, where is it picked up? Where does it come from? But if you look at Manning's book, he traces it back to Rodnell Collins's book, The Seventh Child. And he gives the page numbers and everything. And you go to those page numbers and it has nothing at all to do any sexuality whatsoever. So you wonder, well, maybe it's the wrong page numbers. Then you try another one, you get another source out there. And of course, Bruce Perry's book has been absolutely, the kind of rumors that it put out there. And again, you talk about a book that's exceedingly flawed. Because he tries to do his psychoanalysis. I think he's practicing without a license, Nonetheless, he poses all these different things about it and gets dates wrong and names wrong and what have you. But that's similar to a lot of the books out of there where people have not paid close attention. Proofreading these days is just almost a vanishing art. I mean, Malcolm, even with Manning's book, I mean, it was like some 50 errors that we detected there. There were just factual things, you know. You figure that if you can't get the little simple things right, what happens when you get to the complex ones? And so it kind of like throws you into some doubt about the worthiness of the project, particularly when you discover someone is talking about not sure what year the NAACP was founded, and not sure the distance from the Apollo Theater to the Hotel Teresa. I mean, so those are things like that. You say little factual things, and some of my friends say, well, Herb, let's not deal with the facts, let's get to the interpretation. I say, that's good, because then some of these facts, you know, are related to the interpretation. Because if you can't get it straight, like even with Wolfenstein's book, you're doing a psychoanalytical probe of an individual, and you don't even know what year they were born. You know, you have no, I mean, you screw that up. You know, you get that dates all wrong. Say, wait a minute, you know, you don't know this individual at all, and yet you're trying to psychoanalyze them. So it's something to be said about getting the facts straight. It's certainly, in terms of the interpretive aspects, what can be done there. I mean, all people are entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. You know, you have to go ahead and say, let's deal with what the real facts are. And I guess in this day and age when we live in reality television and the digital universe and social networking, you know, things get a little haywire out there in terms of the dissemination of information and the absolute accuracy and clarity of things. So anyway, beyond the homosexuality, which of course at last Manning dismisses the idea himself. You always wonder, why you raise it then? You know, you can't substantiate it, but I guess he feel the need to kind of raise it, warts and all. I'm going to talk about it and then dismiss it, but it's not a total dismissal. I mean, he kind of conditions it by a particular year, 1952, indicating that even in other places he talk about possible sexual encounters. But we can't have a whole lot of maybe, perhaps, apparently, possibles, and what have you. It's just a lot of supposition, too much supposition out there when you're doing this kind of scholarly endeavor, kind of work on a very important American hero for us. You can't be speculating like that. You know, you got to have some evidence. Similarly, with when you get to the infidelities, what's the source of these infidelities that you're talking about? Well, it's the letter, March the 25th, 1959, that Malcolm writes to Elijah Muhammad. And in the letter, he talks about the difficulties that he's having with his marriage. And it goes on for 3.5, 4 pages. And you can see that. You can see the entire letter if you go on the online and check out Gary Zimet, Z-I-M-E-T. And this is the same guy. He runs his auction company. And he had also the Schindlers and Adolf Hitler and a number of other letters out there supposed to be authentic. And ran into all kind of difficulties and lawsuits and what have you. People was talking about this forgery here, forgery there. And so here he ends up with this letter. And so the question becomes, how did he get the letter? You know, it's a letter that was sent from Malcolm to Elijah, and suddenly it's in his hand. He's auctioning it off for $100,000. So you're concerned about, like, how did Manning then rely on that? So he says he goes to the website called Moments in Time. He sees a letter, and he bases it on that and taking at face value what's there. My concern would be, in the age of agents of repression and the distortions, particularly COINTELPRO, the kind of stuff that they've done out there, you might want to examine the typescript and see exactly, you know, is that coming from his typewriter? You know, and who, in fact, you know, but the key thing there is how does he end up with that letter? And there's been some speculation about that, but I mean, it's a very critical point in terms of the authenticity of that particular letter. So, but that's the source of it, and how it's picked up and spread, you know, from one book to another, from one scholar to another. And they just take it on face value, well, because, hey, if so-and-so said it, it must be all right. I mean, there was an exhibit that they just took down the other day in terms of Malcolm X, and you see how, you know, the number of things that have to be corrected. You know, you have to carefully go through this and vet it and make sure the captions on particular photos in the exhibit are absolutely accurate. So I took my students on the exhibit, and they were just pointing out all of these mistakes and everything. So it forces the old instructor to go back and read it a little bit carefully, because you kind of zoom in through there and taking for granted that the people who put it together did a pretty good job. It just says that we have to be constantly and very vigilantly concerned about, you know, the scholarship out there. So beyond the infidelities and the homosexuality, I just throw those things out there, and also to suggest that what has to be done now, how do we move forward on this? Well, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's a lot of valuable information, you know, in Manning Marable's book. It's almost like, you know, a pot of stew. And if you put one little ingredient in there, does that spoil the whole soup? You know, is a stew destroyed because you didn't put enough onion in there, or you put too much onion in there? Well, if you got too many flaws in there to discredit the book, you toss the book out. So it calls for a careful read in order to get into it and see exactly, you know, separating fact, you know, from fiction. Or sometimes it gets into faction, where it's a combination of fiction and fact, as Alex Haley did so remarkably well. A matter of fact, too well, led to some plagiarism suits. You know, say don't be careful the information you take, because Manning had the same thing. Manning had a number of folks working with him at Columbia University. You know, you round up your crew. And so when people turning stuff into you, you had to carefully check it out and make sure that you're not accepting, you know, without going through and making sure that, first of all, that the facts are right, that, you know, this particular person actually wrote it and then lifted from somewhere else, and boom, it's been passed on second, third generation, and you can't get back to the original. But that's what happened with Alex Haley. He began to take information from his students without checking it out, and they were giving him stuff from other books. I remember Margaret Walker did her best to try to get some money on that deal with her book that she did on Jubilee. And a number of, I mean, I compared that when Roots first came out, I saw so many similarities there. Similarly with Harold Kurlander's book, The African, and he sued and got big buck, you know, way heavy 6 figures, and really hurt Alex Haley's estate sufficiently. So what happens is that, you know, looking at what has to be done as we go forward, we have other books that are coming, other things that have to be done, Muriel, and we're working on that as we look at the W.D. Fard papers that was found in an attic out in Detroit, which gets back to the whole founding of the Nation of Islam. You know, so we're going back to first principles again. You know, can we take it back to the beginning and kind of sort it out and see how this particular thing evolved? And then finally, with the word reinvention, we felt that the word itself, you know, the connotations that it tend to infer, you know, not at all admirable, and suggest that Malcolm was manipulative, that he was very deliberately, you know, doing these things for some kind of self-promotion or self-gain. And so that's why we were concerned with that particular word. I mean, we thought that political evolution, you know, or transformation, which of course pops up quite often in the book, or, you know, a little bit more neutral and softer in terms of his intentions, because he said early on that Malcolm is wearing these masks, you know, so you wonder at what point does he take the mask off? You know, that he's a kind of a trickster. You know, and well, we understand that can work. That's a double-edged sword when you talk about a trickster, because, you know, in our culture we have a number of instances in which that form of tricksterism was a survival element, and how we got over, particularly during the plantation period, you know, when you had to wear the mask, as Paul Laurence Dunbar said. And at last, I can say this. I don't know if you want to have an exchange with me. You have some questions that you want to raise before we go to the audience. If you want to raise some questions, that'd be fine.
I didn't have questions. I did have a comment, though.
Run
to
it.
Contextualize the period in which. Thank you. I said I did have a comment to make with regard to contextualizing the period in which Malcolm lived and struggled, because it is hard to actually put it in 2012 context, actually. And so I just wanted to say something about that, but I'm waiting until you're finished. Thank you, sir.
Well, actually, you know, I could, before I go to the audience, you can conclude with maybe the last stanza of Sonia Sanchez's poem, which she says that she said, "Do not speak to me about living. Life is obscene, and crowds of white on black. And see, death is my pulse. What might have been is not for you, not for him, and not for me. What could have been floods the womb until I drown." Sonia Sanchez. Thank you. Okay, let's fire away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Herb Boyd. I wanted to acknowledge, I mean, it's a belated acknowledgement, but the Comptroller of the City of New York, John Liu, was here, and unfortunately could not stay, but I wanted to put it on the record that he had come, and we hope that we see him again on front pages.
The
Acquisition of things.
The comptroller was here. Did he bring money? I mean,
No, but we hope to see him around in the big leadership aspect of the city of New York.
Sure.
And I'll leave it at that.
yeah, I thanked him for coming out because it's kind of a tit for tat thing, because he knows I'm a journalist with the Amsterdam News. So.
Keep the journalists happy. Is that
Hey man, I'll do some play. You dig? All right. But it would be only fair, though. Okay, I guess we can.
I just wanted to say something, because you know, there weren't a lot of us out there in the 60s. I mean, that's just the reality. And the other thing that I wanted to let you know is that those times were so dangerous, and you just don't get it. If you look at it in 2012 time, you're missing. You know, you have to really look at a time when, you know, Africa was bubbling and demanding and pushing, and you had a guy named Patrice Lumumba, who was a postal worker who was turning the Congo upside down, and was so powerful in that call that the head of the UN went over to see him, and they killed both of them. They killed both of them. And they have never, ever come up with, how did this happen? Well, because the people who are investigating are the people who did it. Very simple. You know what I mean? It doesn't take a genius to figure this one out, you know? And I just wanted to say also that my opportunity to observe Malcolm, I was not a cohort of his, but there were people that I knew who were very close to him. And Malcolm's progression, which was not a mask, it was new growth, new movement, new incorporation of ideas, people who had before been on the outside, now on the inside, and that is part of the synergizing of this new thing that was going to be something. I mean, it really was going to be something, because for the first time, you had a Black American crossing international lines, talking to people who had been never involved in this progression, who had resources of their own. I mean, do you understand that? And you appreciate that. You know, when we get a chance to talk about Gaddafi, hopefully sometime soon, we're going to be looking at this again, because if you don't understand colonization, if you don't understand the way the system moves to contain itself, it will sacrifice everything, anything, you know. I just read a book not too long ago called Spy Master. You would be surprised at the kinds of things these people do. I mean, that they're prepared to write about. I'm not talking about the stuff that's secret. You know? What they're prepared to do. If you get a document from somebody, and I don't want to prolong this, but if you get a document from somebody, you better ask the person, even if the document looks authentic, you better ask them where it came from.
Yes.
Because they got people who create documents. That's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to insert things in people's files. That's their job. Do you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I love about the society that we're putting together here, and I hope I see you again, is because this may be the one place in all of North America where this kind of discussion actually is carried on, and so that you leave with more than what you came with, you know. So I want to thank you, Herb.
Oh, no, it's
And
pleasure.
I want to now open the floor for questions or comments. If you have comments, don't make yours as long as mine. But, you know, please, the floor is open. Yes, sir.
Let me
I guess it's more of a comment than a question. First, I'd like to thank Brother Herb Boyd for your presentation.
Yes.
It's a pleasure.
And for your great work. I didn't know until you mentioned it that you had been a member of the Nation of Islam, so was I, during the time that Malcolm was there. And you might have been there. I was also at the meeting at Manhattan Center, which caused him to get suspended, where he made the famous chicken come home to roost statement around the assassination of President Kennedy.
You know, and there's no real recording of that either.
No, it's not. Mm-hmm. You know,
but Khalil Islam told me that he was standing right there when it was said.
Yes.
And that was Thomas 15X Johnson. He became, you know, Khalil Islam, and we lost him August the 4th, 2004.
Yes. Some of those people are gone. Some are still around. You know,
yes.
Some of us. But I just happened to be there and share that moment in history, and didn't realize what a historic moment it was until maybe the next day, and after it's over, the rest is history. But there's so much can be said about Malcolm. Now, this book that we are discussing, put out by Manning Marable, I have the book, and I have, you know, certain concerns about it too, as most of us who was around Malcolm and knew, you know, also share. But then I have the opinion too that none of us are perfect as we go through life. You know what I mean? Malcolm was such a remarkable person, you know, who, in the teaching of Mr. Muhammad, he has raised himself up from a patent criminal to be one of the greatest men of the 20th century, of the last century. So we have to look at that beautiful transformation of Malcolm X. But I first met him in the 1950s, actually, around 1958. And believe it or not, in Virginia, not New York City.
Wow, right.
In Richmond, Virginia. But I'm so proud to have met him, to have been able to interact with him. And there's a lot we can say. I know other people have things to say.
Thank you, Minister.
You know, about
right,
that.
thank you.
To give you, while the microphone is moving, I just want you to know that in the 50s, to get him on the radio, you had to fiddle the dial, okay, on the far right side. And sometimes it would come in, but a lot of times it was blocked, you know. I mean, the Nation of Islam was underground, period, straight up. I mean, people had to be careful, because it was considered, you know, they didn't know what to make of these people, you know. And so, I mean, again, I'm recontextualizing for you so that you understand that what you're looking at now, you've seen 40, 50 years, 60 years of change with regard to what is possible on the public scene, but the guts of it, you know. So that when Malcolm was taking this stuff on, I mean, Malcolm was like a lone rider, you know, in a very serious sense, and I don't want to go on. The microphone is in somebody's hands. Yes, sir, brother.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for writing the book, and I read your articles, and, you know, we all go back.
But this is, keep in mind that this is an
Collection
anthology.
of essays, yes.
I'm just the editor there. Richard Wright said that
Thank you for
to be an editor, all you need is a pot of glue and a pair of scissors. Yeah. But of course, in the digital age, it's even faster. But again, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Anyway, what's important here, and when I pick up the book, because I had read Manning's book, it is a historical replay of a polemic within African American history. Malcolm had represented the liberationist, nationalist tendency within our history. I would argue that comrade and brother Manning, or some of his latter positions, collapsed into a social democratic accommodationist position. And within that polemic, it's always that negation. Now, what made Brother Malcolm important is that at the time of his assassination, he had mobilized to the public space a nationalism that was revolutionary, but is also particularly secular. Because after Garvey was attacked and demised, African American nationalism became religious nationalism. And that what caught Elijah Muhammad. Also, too, as we examine Malcolm and what makes Malcolm important, and it's not his charismatic symbolism, but I go back to the time when he was in prison, meaning that Malcolm's articulation wasn't what it was when he came out in '52. What he did was to read the dictionary. And the reason why I raise this from A to Z, as Malcolm asked the most of himself, he demanded the most from the world. And thus, when he was purged out of the nation after the Kennedy assassination, because he had been in the member when he came out of prison in '52, so his political life wasn't it was militant, but it wasn't as radical. So when his travels, how he absorbed all that, talking with Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Sekou Touré, Jomo Kenyatta, Nasser, how he could synthesize all that in a year's time, right? And thus, as a religious person, led the catalyst of the radicalization of the African American population, because everyone else had failed. The CPUSA, whatever, other left formations. And so we have to see Malcolm as a catalyst for the polemic that is still going on in African American history of accommodation or liberation or self-determination. And what Manning, from what I read, had really misunderstood was the revolutionary implications of nationalism, particularly coming from Malcolm, because it's always viewed as narrow-minded, but to be self-determinationist in a, excuse the term, somewhat selective fascistic American society, that in itself is revolutionary. And I'm going to end it here because not the essential contradiction in that period, but the principal contradictions of that period was imperialist oppression and national liberation. Now, the essential contradiction was not being exploited, which existed before Karl Marx. But the principle, the contradiction that you see, and Malcolm best represented that, and thus he was a catalyst for the resecularization of black revolutionary nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Solid. Let me just add, let me put a tag on that. I would direct you to page 20. Do you have the book in there? I don't know if you have the book anyway. Read page 20. Jeff will pass it there to you. That's Dr. Maulana Karenga's essay. And he deals with that in a very thorough fashion and showing how you move from nationalism to the kind of revolutionary nationalism that you're suggesting, as well as the internationalism. Because, and you're absolutely correct in terms of this speed. He was a quick study. Malcolm was a quick study. My interviews with Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Clark said that Malcolm was the best student he ever had. Tremendous. And they wrote they sat in his table and put together the principles, the organizing principles of the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
By Kwame Nkrumah's organization.
Exactly. Yeah, or OAU to the OAAU. But anyway, you pointed out the number of people he was coming into contact with, and including in Algeria with Ben Bella, and including Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, including Nnamdi Ezekwe in Nigeria. And it's amazing that he became he was like our minister with our portfolio, or our ambassador, or our president of Black America. They were recognizing him, a minute or two, on that same level in terms of how he was bringing the message there. But he had a larger message too, in terms of what he was trying to do within a religious context, because he had moved firmly into orthodoxy. He was a Sunni Muslim, and of course, that would put him at odds with a lot of folks who were carrying baggage, from understanding exactly what the Nation of Islam was all about. I went in when I was like 20 years old, and one of the things we learned right away is what you're talking about here is that we're the lost found nation. We're in the wilderness of North America, and a certain kind of precepts and cosmology has to be put into effect, because we have been robbed, of our ancestry, our culture, and our history. And in terms of the cosmology, in terms of the Yaku theory, that also was rationalized and justified in terms of the other people talking about they're the chosen people. And we can make that same kind of assertion in terms of where we come from as being the original people, and the whole grafting of the other folks. Like this Theodore Ellen would love something about the invention of the white race in terms of the Yaku theory and how they kind of come together. But you're absolutely right in terms of your commentary.
Because it forced the nation to collapse into my uncle was one, Masonic theory. Right, and thus moving away from what is called orthodox, because we were never African people, we're Asiatic black men. Mm-hmm. And I was also a member of the Nation of Islam, and we had to wear our hair short because our hair was originally the hair on our eyebrows. So we was forced to go to Africa to toughen ourselves up. So there was still a rejection of the African-centered, or just who you are, right? And two, the class dynamics in the nation, which they couldn't handle, because if you're telling people, like you're growing businesses, you're buying land, and the best you can get is people who say, well, the white man's the devil, grafted, and the pig is this, that, and the other. You're not going to get graduate students from Harvard or Howard to run your businesses. So that led to some of the liberalization, because they needed part of the educated class to help run those businesses. Because originally, if you came out of jail, it would reform you and put you somewhat in a stable situation, which was a good thing. But outside of moral reform, to take power here, you need a program, and that's what Malcolm was groping for.
Exactly.
And that's how we have to understand and look at Malcolm.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Brother?
I have a comment, and I wanted to... actually, I had two comments, and I wanted to get a reaction on one of them from you, please, Professor. First comment is, I would like to thank you for your efforts. I know that you have insatiable appetite for information, and there's so many things you could have been working on, so many things you want to work on, and the fact that you took this time out to work on this book and to help inform all of us is greatly beneficial and appreciated, particularly the fact that the proceeds are going to not to yourself, but to actually help continue Malcolm's legacy is something
Exactly.
I think is very commendable. So personally, I would like to thank you.
It was a beautiful.
The comment that I want to get a reaction from you on is this. I had heard about the Manning book, and I read it, and my personal feeling was that there were things that I questioned or said, hey, maybe this isn't so, what have you. But as a devil's advocate, so to speak, I looked at it and said, well, even if everything he says or suggests is true, it actually made me admire Malcolm all the more. In other words, as much as Malcolm had, as smart as he was, as fearless as he was, as much as he sacrificed and contributed for society as a whole and our people in particular, if he had a secret of homosexuality, if he was going through marital strains, in addition to people trying to kill him and discredit him and all, if he was going through all those other things additionally and didn't have certain support, it made me feel like, well, then he's even badder than I thought he was. Yeah. And so I want to get your reaction to what, if those, you know, what's the worst case scenario if people buy into the, because obviously the Manning book is a bestseller. What do you think the worst case scenario is if people walk away seeing that book as gospel truth?
That's a kind of counterintuitive way of doing it, isn't it, right? Way to go, Ade, right? No, the thing is that just on the homosexual thing, for example, when if Malcolm would have had his druthers, you know who would have been the writer with him? James Baldwin. Ain't that something? Huh? The thing about it, they couldn't work their schedules out. And can you imagine the majesty and the poet, the lyricism and stuff like that? Not to discount or discredit Alex Haley, because he was a very fine craftsman, but in terms of the literary flair that Baldwin could have brought, and also the kind of understanding that they were brothers, you know, coming out of a common cauldron of Harlem. And I think one was kind of like, as I kind of talk about this in one of my books, Baldwin's Harlem. I have a whole chapter on Baldwin and Malcolm. And one was seeing that, well, he's the poetic warrior. Another one was like the warrior poet. But I think that they both had these tendencies, this kind of understanding of language. I remember in the autobiography, Malcolm is having this discussion with Alex Haley. I know that Alex couldn't keep up with him because they were into philology and linguistics and stuff, and Malcolm was running it on him. He was trying to figure out, you know, etymology, and I mean, my goodness, he said. So, you know, he was saying, I think I get where you're going, you know, but I don't think he really understood what Malcolm was trying to say in terms of himself. He is an autodidact, yes, you know, and being, you know, self-taught. Because he was concerned, I mean, one of the regrets he had, he did not get the education. But he's talking to these here heads of state. You know, come on, you know, 8th grade, boom, boom. But the prison had become that institution there where he self-taught and just grappled with it word from aardvark all the way through the dictionary. He was concerned the same way James Baldwin did it. James was pretty much an autodidact. You know, I mean, what college did he go to? You know, I mean, he comes straight out of the Harlem, what he called it in those days, the Hollows, 131st and Park Avenue, you know, back when they were playing on coal piles and everything. But he comes out of that particular background, so he had this here kind of amenity and understanding of where Malcolm was coming from. And so when they hooked up, and I guess the crowning achievement is when one day when I was lost is what Baldwin came up with in terms of trying to do the screenplay. Because if you read Seventh Child, Rodney L. Collins' book, he talked about his mother, Ella Collins, was saying that we want James Baldwin on this project. And if he can't do it with the book, then maybe he can do the screenplay. And he did the screenplay, Marvin Worth and all of the kind of going back and forth that never really got off the ground. But to a great degree, Spike Lee used a lot of that, you know, in his film version, you know, the biopic that he did on it. So Malcolm had in mind, and the debates that went on, and they became friends, solid friends over the years. And it was amazing that, so the whole homosexual thing, if you said that, in fact, in one of my Fred said, there's a very good essay in the book that Kevin Magruder does, and he talks about the situational sex, in terms of, that's one way that you could play it down. But I would say, well, if he were a homosexual, that in and of itself, because if you're going to dismiss him on those grounds, then what are you going to do with James Baldwin? What are you going to do with Bayard Rustin? But of course, the question is it true? Because you don't necessarily want to put a label on someone when it doesn't apply. And that's such a basic concern we had. If it's real, and in fact, he had these encounters, because there's only 3 people who really know. The person who did it, the person who was done to, and some eyewitness. And Shorty Jarvis was not an eyewitness. He was never with Malcolm on any of these powdering incidents. When they're dropping the talcum powder on folks and rubbing down William Paul Lennon. He was never there. So it's almost like in a court of law, what do you call it, Jules? Hey, hearsay.
I wanted to point out something before we go on, and that is to say that when Malcolm was doing his travels, Malcolm's the kind of person who picked up every piece. Mm-hmm. He didn't drop anything. He picked it up and moved it on to the next level. And he was putting in his head, I'm just convinced of this, putting in his head the potential of coming back this way to hook up the next level of organization, and that's what made him even more dangerous, because the people who run, or the people who are the powerful, are always concerned about shifts in production, shifts in resources, shifts in transport, and shifts in profit. And they go berserk, and like some of the stuff that you see on TV, that is light lunch. They've been doing that, And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that he had the intelligence of a Secretary of State or president. That's what I'm trying to say to you. I'm trying to say that this man was operating on multiple levels, And I wanted to just take one other step forward on Malcolm, because he had a public persona and he also had a private persona. He used to talk about people in the civil rights movement like a dog. How silly we were, how stupid we were, all this kind of stuff. And we had running telephone conversations back and forth. Do you understand what I'm saying? His secretary used to be in SNCC. I'm just saying that what was fed to the public was not necessarily what was actually going on. I'm just trying to say that, I think this man had such a worldview that it was frightening. Because all the pieces, all he needed to do was slot in the pieces. And everybody was poised. At that point in time, we actually had leadership of integrity almost on every continent. And everybody was listening. That was a very powerful moment. And that's why I knew when Malcolm got killed, I said, this is bigger than the nation. They may have been the people who were allowed to pull the trigger, but they weren't the people who laid the plan. Okay?
Or made the bullets.
Or made the bullets.
Yes.
So that, I'm finished. Yes, sir.
I just have a simple question. I assumed that Manning knew he was dying because he had that history of, what was it?
The sarcoidosis.
Yeah, and all
and a
that.
double lung transplant.
Exactly.
And pneumonia. Goodness.
Right. So I was just curious, that in your research into the production of the book, was there any hint that they tried to rush it at all in order to get it out while he was still going to be able to appreciate it? Because if you've been reading books as long as I have, and I know you have been reading books, you know that the publishing industry is not what it was, and they cut a lot of the lower level copywriters, fact checkers.
Sure.
It isn't until the second or third edition that you're going to get a clean copy. I was just wondering if there was any hint of that kind of, push to get the book out.
It's a lot of the kind of details, the personal ins and outs of what was happening between Manning and his editor. He talks about it in the book a bit. You have to go back to see the proposal. You actually have to see the proposal. Now, I've heard all kind of scuttlebutt about the proposal, what you have to do and how he was able to command, such a large advance. you know, because he promised to do this and promised to do that. But one of the things he could not deliver, was the 3 missing chapters. And for what I know from rumor and innuendo, that was a part of the proposal, that he was going to present those, you know what I'm saying, Gary, those 3 missing chapters. And when he went out to Detroit, Greg Reed, who bought those missing chapters back at an auction at the Haley Estate back in 1991, 92, he spent big buck for that, you know, so he's been holding it pretty close to his vest and not willing to let it go until he can get the right kind of compensation for it, because he invested heavily in that. So when Manning went out there, he only saw it for 15 minutes. It took him to the lounge, he just opened it up, and boop, that was it. So he didn't really get a chance to look at it. But what he did see and what he commented on, he told Simon Black, you know, who was the International Socialist Party, he told him that what I saw was it all was the 3 chapters, which is called The End of Christianity, the 22 million Muslims or 20 million Muslims, and the Negro, was all written before he left the Nation of Islam. So it wouldn't amplify a lot of the thinking as he moved out of that political straitjacket that he was inside of the nation, and because then he's grappling and growing at such a rapid pace. And Herman Ferguson said it very well in one of his chapters. He was moving at almost like warp speed, moving much too fast. And then you can imagine the world. I mean, he's going 27 weeks of his last 50 weeks of his life he spends on either Africa or the Middle East. I mean, he's constantly on the road. So that has a lot to do with your whole family situation when you have that kind of travel agenda. I mean, and then the people you're contacting and the information that you're gathering. You're absolutely right in terms of like this kind of worldview, the kind of international perspective, but both from a religious standpoint. And Manning does make a point in terms of the bridge that he supplied between the Middle East, the Islamic world, and this growing internationalism, and make sure that the cause that the African American people have is taken to the United Nations. And it's just charging them with genocide, more or less, you know. So here it is, you know, in terms of the bigger target that he becomes, the FBI and CIA, to say nothing that he knew at one point in the last page of his autobiography, I'm a walking dead man. He knew it was just about up, in the same way you might say that Manning knew it was just about up for him. And maybe that had a lot to do with him not having an opportunity to go back over and kind of fine-tune and comb out some of those inconsistencies, because you're talking about a nearly 600-page book. And any of us who have written books, Jeff, we know exactly what you write on page 10. By the time you get to page 110, if you don't go back and check it out, you may have a whole different understanding of something, and you just have to keep kind of processing. It's a process that you're going through in terms of developing this information and making sure you got it right. So you have to go back and reread it. And I'm sure that the way it was coming in, he didn't have a chance to do the kind of job on it that he would have preferred to do. Thinking is in the best scenario with his health in top-flight condition, a lot of those things would have been corrected. Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Melanie?
So did you mind just speaking
Just to add a little more to the conversation on Malcolm's political development and his international perspective, you know, being around him at that time. Malcolm was an internationalist before he left the Nation of Islam. Some people are under the illusion that all of that took place after he left. Brother Herb, you can saw that Malcolm was denouncing colonialism when he was in the nation. He had great admiration for the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. You know, he made speeches about that. Like no other Muslim minister, Malcolm, you know, consulted with people on the outside, like you said, including people like John Henry Clark, Professor Simmons, like a shadow cabinet, as Dr. Clark called it. But what I'm saying is that Malcolm had that broad view even before Malcolm was denouncing the Vietnam War at least 5 years before Dr. King got there, when he was still in the Nation of Islam. So I'm just saying we have to appreciate that process of growth. It didn't start after he left the nation. That was going on long while he was there.
Exactly.
Now, there are 10 years of speeches or more that was left with the nation that we don't even have of the work that he did. The letter that you had mentioned about, I read the letter.
I heard that.
But there's so much, could be said about that. But he was just a remarkable human being. But Malcolm laid the foundation, for much of what we call liberation theology, today. Give him credit for that, just like he had mentors. His father was a Garveyite. But the Nation of Islam itself is still misunderstood by most people who've never been there. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, most people don't like to talk about him nowadays, does not get the credit that he deserves. That man was out there during the 1930s calling the enemy out. He took a young man like Malcolm and made him, whatever happened between them that happened. He took a young man like Malcolm and made him one of the great men of the past century. The only man you got in America now that can call 1 million men to Washington and 2 million show up was also a student of Mr. Muhammad. And Malcolm was the main one who trained Farrakhan.
He was.
So a lot can be said about that. The whole thing is that Malcolm was politically advanced even when he was in the nation. He was an internationalist.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
And that's,
Jeff, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
I was just saying that speaks to the redemptive aspects of the Nation of Islam in terms of people coming out of the dungeons of this country and being, elevated to that status, certainly is remarkable. Yes. Thank you, babe.
So our most brilliant minds came out of the nation. The man who heads Schonberg today is Elijah Muhammad's grandson or great-grandson.
Great-grandson, Khalil Gibran and Muhammad. Thank you, babe.
Well, first of all, I'm just so grateful that I am here because growing up right behind all of you, Malcolm meant a lot to me and my generation. But I was around, just a kid, around for the big things. But what I think is so important, and you say it, but I want to put another kind of balance on it. Spiritually, when that door opened, we saw something else emerge as human beings in that human struggle. And the gift that he left was the gift that Wallace Dean Muhammad so exemplified. And, there are people out there, many more, who have that wisdom today, and that wisdom of interfaith, religion, and spirituality, and that interconnectedness and heart to heart. So, in reference to what you say, I think there's an old saying that describes it best. Never forget that what you teach is teaching you. And I'm just so grateful that there was a Malcolm. I bought the book, Manning Marable's book, as soon as it came out. I read the reviews. I was hoping that he would focus on that very last year, so that we could understand the bridge that was being created across the world. And so when I discovered it wasn't that, it wasn't very interesting to me anymore.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Jeff?
I would like to thank her so very much for the presentation and for writing the book and for all your other efforts. We're all facing some really hard times now, and we got a younger generation that's coming up, and they're really getting hit with it. And I wonder if you could just Because we have a national audience, right? And you get a chance to speak to them here. And if you could just offer in a couple minutes what you think they might look to draw from Malcolm, you know, based on your understanding of him, what might be some things that they can draw from him?
You know, one of the things about, I have a very good friend in Detroit, and probably out of all of the folks out there that know anything about Malcolm X's life, he's probably the foremost expert. And I have like this irredeemable respect for, and his name is Paul Lee. And one of the things that Paul always stresses is that the best thing you can do is to let Malcolm speak for himself. And the speeches, I think you have to really go back to, and you have to be careful with the speeches as well, because a lot of them have been edited, and depending on what company is putting together, they may delete some stuff from it that robs it of its vitality or absolute meaning. But I think for young people out there is to go ahead and really, I mean, you go on YouTube these days and see all kind of stuff on Malcolm. It's amazing. Just the other day, I was looking at a couple of things I hadn't seen before. Even the man I'm talking about, Paul Lee, has put up a piece that was for many, many years, you know, just no one knew anything about. So here it is. So I would think that if they can go back and read the autobiography and listen to the speeches, as we get whatever visual, because we live in this age where these young people, the attention span is so short, and they need to kind of come into a visual, audio-visual orientation and background. And that may be the most helpful thing for them, is to get acquainted with Malcolm through his own words. And you got books out there. Matter of fact, there's a couple young books for young readers in which Malcolm is talking. And toward the end of his life, he did a lot of that with young people at the forums that the militant forums. They were bringing young people into that, as well as when he went down to Selma, Alabama, and spoke at Brown Chapel down there. That just the same 2 weeks before his assassination, he was down in Selma, and a lot of the young people turned out there from SNCC and SCLC and what have you. So that was an opportunity where he began to tamp down this whole attack, you know, on the Big Six and the other civil rights leaders. He began to kind of draw back on that and open. And at the same time, and we brought Fannie Lou Hamer. When Fannie Lou Hamer came to New York, and that was an instance of him reaching out, where even going to the March on Washington, though he called it a farce on Washington, nonetheless, he was there, you know, and beginning in that quick rendezvous that he had with Dr. King, that photo that you see quite often, and whether that was staged and what have you, but nonetheless, that was, and he told Coretta Scott King when he was down in Selma, because at that time Dr. King was in jail, he told, say, look, I got your back. You know, anything happened, you know, just call on me, I'm at your service. So he was beginning to reach out for the civil rights movement, but at the same time, he was not diminishing or losing sight on the human rights, because he saw the conjunction, he saw the connection. And I think that's important, that you see the whole, the evolution of these ideas. And many people speculate, James Cone does a good job in his book, speculating the possibility of the convergence, the trajectory of their lives, Dr. King and Martin coming closer and closer together. Can you imagine what that would have been, huh? In terms of how devastating, in terms of the unification of the struggle in this country, having those two big thinkers on the same page.
I would like to just throw in a little bit as an old teacher to the national audience. I think young people need to look at Malcolm's life as an example of how to transition from wherever they are to another place. You start with where you are, not where everybody else is or where you think they need to be, but you start with yourself. I think that you have to learn how to cut the TV off. I think you need to learn how to expand your opportunity to concentrate, you know, to focus, to think, read everything. I'm a person that read it all. Even read about people who hate you. That's all right. Didn't say you have to own it. Read it so you know what they're saying, okay? But the example of Malcolm, here's a fella, actually it was a boy hanging out in the street, getting caught up in some mess. I used to work at Rikers, so I know all about that, okay? Who, at some point, an epiphany happened, and he decided that was not the way his life was going to go from that point forward. Now, that was Mr. Muhammad, absolutely, but all of us have people who knock on the door and say, are you there? Are you ready? Okay? At some point, you have to say, I am ready to take the next step. You must learn how to read. There are lots of thoughts out there. No one's going to tell you what to believe, but you have to have a reservoir of information. Okay? And then you will, when you get there, you will know that you're there because it's now going to run over. And so you no longer keep it in. You start talking to somebody else about, well, did you read this or did you read that? And the people who say, oh, man, I don't want to be bothered with that, you learn how to say, they used to be my friend. I'm going to go find some new friends because I want to meet somebody or talk to somebody who's going to talk back to me about the things that interest me that have to do with the progress of my people. And you're on your way. You're on your way. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, for the national audience, and as we look at the life of brother and comrade Malcolm, one of the things we have to understand, Malcolm was an organizer. Example, when Malcolm had the Muslims surround the police precinct, and it got to Mike Wallace, it was Malcolm that in 1958, the hate that produced hate, that began to articulate the view of the nation in relation to American racism.
1959.
59, excuse me. Also, too, Malcolm would go out and organize mosques, but it was Malcolm who but organized Muhammad Speaks
Yes.
as a newspaper. Malcolm, as a speaker, didn't always deal with Yaku and the white man as the devil. Right. He was a polemicist, challenging the limits of integration and the civil rights movement. He was a polemicist. I only say that for what young people must learn, because we cannot offer them organization right now, cadre training right now. We don't have the institutions for it. But what we can teach them is the ability to question. And without that, nothing will come to fruition in this country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
The ability to question.
Thank you. Other questions? Were you going to say something? Yes, sir. He needs a mic. You have to feed it in through the mic so it's recorded.
Mr. Boyd, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to meet you, sir. Having said that, I'm going to challenge you on something. A number of people that I've spoken to within the black community feel that the reason why we failed to have another Malcolm X, so to speak, from the time of his death up until now, 2012, is for two simple reasons: the power of the almighty dollar and the specter of death. Do you agree?
Well, Gary, let me say it like this here. You know, from a standpoint of the commercial, the enterprise, the endeavors in this country, we know that it's a bottom line orientation, you know. And even when you talk about that book, I mean, a lot was invested in Manning Marable's book. So you got to get your money back on this thing. That's where the promotion comes in. That's where the advertising comes in. That's where those reviews came in. You got to get the book exposed. I was just the other day, went online and followed his instructions toward the end of this book. He says, if you want to get more information about this project, here are the links that you can go to. But if you go to those links, you have to be a Columbia student or staff to get in, to give you access to the site. You cannot say that you're a researcher because they don't have the license to do that yet. You know what I'm saying? So it's going to be a while before just independent researchers can get to that information to give another even commercial spin to the possibility of added profits, perhaps, you know. So the whole question of like, you know, dollarism is something that Malcolm talked about all the time. I mean, that was his thing in terms of how this country, in terms of the profit aspects, in terms of capitalism, in terms of imperialism and colonialism, all of those things played right into the bottom line. And that's what they have in mind all the times in terms of the exploitation of the people. That's why toward the end of his life, I think you had him moving more and more in terms of his analysis, that he was beginning to apply more and more of class analysis. And he had let go the kind of the demonology stuff, you know, he didn't need that any longer because that was part and parcel of the other experience, but it's a constant evolution. That he's going, how he can begin to understand, well, how are you going to bring about change, you know? So possibly the ballot or the bullet began to suggest some of those things because he was saying that even the electoral process is something we can utilize. So all these tools then become more and more available that were not a part of his arsenal before. So now he's like growing to a point that now he have a full arsenal of attack in terms of civil rights, human rights, in terms of the race analysis, the class analysis, and also the concern about gender. You know, people kind of overlook the fact that, you know, coming out of the Nation of Islam in terms of where they stood on the whole gender question, but he was trying to make sure, even when he started the OAAU, you know, he put Lynn Shefflett was right in a leadership position. You know, so he brought a woman right in there. Now that may have disturbed, you know, some of the old school folks who were coming out of the nation and saying, no, what's going on with that? Or just the reversal of certain practices there as it applied to the religious concepts, the kind of theology that had been developed, you know, in the Nation of Islam. So he was trying to do away. I mean, it's a revolutionary process that's going on in terms of understanding how the society operates, the whole exploitation, how we began to question certain the corporate aspects. You know, he was dead on that. I mean, that's what he was talking to, and I think this government began to recognize how dangerous he was becoming, because from an international standpoint, when you have all these major corporations out there, and suddenly he's beginning to talk about the nationalization of the mineral resources, and suddenly the connection that you have to certain enterprises in this country, can you imagine the kind of threat that would bring in terms of cutting into the profits of these here transnational corporations? So you certainly, dollarism is part of it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yolanda.
Thank you, Muriel, and thank you so much, Herb, for just your indefatigable commitment to us and to constantly lifting us up and challenging us to think. I appreciate the brother's comment, and I'm trying to get my thoughts together and try to do it quickly. And I wonder, because I was on the Malcolm X project as a graduate student with Manning, but
Yes.
that's just putting the autobiography online.
Yes.
And I was thinking about what you were saying, sister, about how you were hoping for something, and when you got to a certain part in the book, you realized it wasn't about that. And so my question is, this has been a 10-year commitment. So in 10 years, choices can be made, I would imagine, in terms of what to focus on and what not to focus on. And to connect it back to that brother's point, I wonder how much was it a rush to put the book out, and how much is it, and I'm thinking about the mountaintop as well, how much in terms of not that our leaders and our heroes are above reproach, but to ruin their credibility. So whether it be sort of this new narrative about Dr. King being such a womanist and all these other things that we're hearing, and now this very historic, and I believe it will be a historic text, of what Malcolm was or wasn't, that these capitalist forces, right, that do put these texts out and put these shows on Broadway, being very particular to Martin and Malcolm and what our leaders have been for us. How much of you think is, and I'm a conspiracy theorist, How much you think is deliberate in all of this? If you understand the question, I was just sort of rambling, but my love goes to you and everything that you do, and thank you for being here tonight.
Yolanda, she asked a question to answer it too. That's it. But I think that's a part of, like, you know, as we gather understanding where Malcolm was. I mean, understand now, he's 39 years old. This is 1965. He's out there. I mean, he's walking a tightrope. He's nervous. His house, I mean, he's getting phone calls. People are shadowing him. He's under surveillance. Can you imagine the anxiety, the trepidation from, I mean, just trying to organize his life with all of these particular demons and fears, you know, hovering, every shadow. 2 or 3 times, even at his house when he arrived there, and he see these 2 men standing there in the darkness. And he figured it's all over. And people feel that maybe the death wish came in at some point. How did I get out of this situation? Because he knew, because he said, I trained them. I know exactly what they're capable of. But add to that, the complexity of this here is the whole international question again, you know, the whole corporate enterprises and what's going on. And even with the autobiography, when you understand that the Doubleday backed up on that. And it was Grove Press that picked it up. And we just lost Barney Rossett, who was the founder of Grove Press. And he put out all those other very controversial books, Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, that caused quite a stir. Lady Chatterley's Lover, you know, books that nobody else would touch. And he put them out there. And so, and then the whole going back and forth with the editors there. I mean, Alex Haley was struggling there, trying to get him additional money. Near the end, when his house was firebombed, he had to go and stay up the street there with Ruby Dee's brother, Mr. Thomas Wallace. And then he had all of the money he made. It's just like it went right back to the nation. He didn't own the house. Eventually, after they firebombed it, the next day or so, he's evicted. Because he went back on February 15th and tried to pick up what was salvageable from the fire. So right away, I mean, you add all of these here different kind of pressures on his life. It's amazing that he was able to accomplish as much as he did. And many people felt that what he should have done is, since he made such solid connections with all of these African leaders, and on a couple of occasions, particularly in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, later on W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, we ended up making that his home, that he was offered those opportunities to stay in Africa. But, you know, the greater issue for him was the circumstances, the conditions of his people in this country. And he felt out of necessity he had to come back and be a part of the struggle, even if it meant, you know, that his life, he knew his life was in danger, and that the possibility of annihilation, extermination was almost at any point. And toward the end, I think people speculate about Dr. King having these same kind of, these intimations, this kind of intuition that something very, very violent is going to happen, that he's trying to spare some other people not to be caught in the crossfire. Read Herman Ferguson's book, The Unlikely Warrior. He talks about that in a very, very meaningful way, I think, in terms of the last, because he was he was there in the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights on that day in which Malcolm was gunned down, and some of the things that he saw. And he saw some of the stuff that was leading up to it as well, that indicated to him that his life was in imminent danger, that it wouldn't be very long. So he may have had a rush too, in terms of hurry up and getting his autobiography finished. In the same way you said earlier about possibly with Manning, recognizing that the clock was ticking. I'm gonna have to hurry up and get this job done, because I don't think I have very long to be here. And sometimes we can hear the kind of the death rattle, you know, in our lives, you know. And so he said, let me hurry up and get this thing done. He told Alex Haley, Malcolm told Alex Haley, I'll never see the finished product. And he never did. He got a chance to look at some of the last chapters when they met out at the airport. But after that, I mean, the final version, he didn't get a chance to see it. And we know that because we had an opportunity to see the annotated version. Well, what's being done now is Greg Reed, who owns the original manuscript, and he's going through it and annotating it and showing the disparities between the published account and the one that they have in his possession. So you can see the kind of the marginalia, the kind of crossing out the deletions, the rewrites, and everything that Malcolm is suggesting, and none of those things were done. So it's almost talking about another book. So we're working on that in terms of like annotating that. If Greg comes along with it, I mean, that should be a revelation along with the 3 missing chapters.
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
You speaking to the mic, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan, and I wanted to ask you a question, if I may. Towards the end of his life, one of the most important things to Malcolm was reaching out to and connecting with young people.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, when it comes to reaching young people today and helping them to become critical, analytical, independent, African-minded thinkers, what do you suggest be done in that today's youth is very, very different from the youth of the 60s and the 70s and even up into the mid-80s? Do you have any feedback on what we could do to reach these young people in regards to their ability to think for themselves? Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think what you're doing is part of that process because you're trying to get your education together. You're trying to process information and be in a position where you can teach. Because, you know, you have a responsibility and obligation, you know, to go ahead and do a job, too, in terms of reaching the young people. We say that it's 3 ways you acquire it, you know, enlightenment and education, consciousness, and that is in your family. It starts in the family. Then after the family, it's the school systems, the educational process. Then after that, it's your peer group, which you can pick up from your friends in the streets and what have you. So if the family is missing and the educational system is falling apart, then, you know, and the peer group will take in and take over. And that may be the intervention that's absolutely necessary from people with some consciousness as you have and you possess, that you have to jump in there and take that role as a mentor. You know, a lot of us, you know, got a few hours that we can give from time to time, as Melanie does quite often in her storytelling with young people. And the earlier you can get them, the better. You know, you get them very early and begin to give them your own proper indoctrination. You know, give them the kind of survival skills and the education that they need, you know, coming from your background, because you've been there, you know what it's about. Malcolm X's autobiography, to a great degree, is a cautionary tale, too. You know, okay, here's what I did, and people figure that maybe they can go through that same process and reach the same kind of heights. But at the same time, he said, toward the end of the book, he began to tell you, no, this is not the way you do it. The one thing I wish had happened in my life was an opportunity to get more education. That was the only regret that he had, you know, and so, but despite that, you know, he went on, he recognized that deficiency and he worked on it. Our young people need that kind of guidance, more so than ever, because there's so many other kind of distractions out there. And, you know, they got access to all of this technology. It's absolutely amazing in terms of social networking, what's going on, and how do we get involved in that process and make sure they're doing the right kind of social networking, you know, because you have to be there and look over their shoulders and help them out. You have that responsibility, obligation as a parent, you know, as an elder, as one who has been through that. You know exactly what's needed So you don't have to be listening to nobody here. You know what to do. Thanks, Jonathan. By the way, he's one of my students,
Are there
at
any,
this College of New Rochelle, not at City College, at College of New Rochelle. I have one of my students here from City College, James Persay. James is back there. He knows he's going to get that A now, man.
are there any further questions or comments? I beg your pardon? You would like to make a last comment?
Well, at least some people say, yeah. I would like to add some more to the conversation.
Okay, take the mic.
I know the brother behind me was asking why there are no other Malcolm X's out there. Where can we find them? And I'm sitting here reflecting in the meaning of Malcolm X. You probably got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Malcolm X's out there that you don't even know about or don't see. One of the things, among others, to pick up about Malcolm's life and take under consideration that there are more young black men in prison today than in college. The point is that that's deliberate. Also recognize that some of our brightest minds, some of our most brilliant young people are those who are behind bars.
That's right.
And my brother, each generation creates its own leaders. Time and circumstances create leaders. You would step forward. The leaders, the young people of today, have just as much potential, if not more, than ours had. The conditions that they face today was very similar to the conditions that was during my generation. I'm 72 years old. You have gangs now, the Crips and the Bloods back in the 50s, and Brother Hurd will back me up. We had gangs back in the 50s too. Just as mean as the ones you got now. They didn't have the weapons. They were just as mean. You couldn't go from Brooklyn to Manhattan or the Bronx sometimes without looking over your shoulder. Chicago had some of the meanest gangs that's still around. But what I'm saying is that it goes from generation to generation. We had a drug problem, now it's crack cocaine. In the 50s, we had heroin, okay? The same generation also gave us Malcolm X. It gave us the Stoke the car makers. That same generation gave us Dr. King in spite of what we was up against. You have young people out there now, who I think will step forward and rise to the occasion. When I saw 1 million show up in Washington, D.C., 2 million at the Million Man March, that told me something. We concentrate on the negative a lot rather than the positive. That should have been a signal that there are a lot of positive, forward-looking young black men and women out there. But we have to understand the onward flow of history. Malcolm X was a product of his time. You have those out there now who will rise to the occasion. It might not even be necessary for another Malcolm X. We need a lot of Malcolms now. But the point is that have faith in these young people out here now. Support them, back them up, and understand that there's a lot of genius, in our young people.
I wanted to say one quick thing, and I think we're getting ready to wrap.
Sure.
If you go online and you pose a question, something you want to know about, and you follow out that question till you exhaust what's up there, you're going to see some percentage of that information is going to be, another percentage of it was going to be like, I've heard that before, and another percentage of it is going to be, I can work with this. Okay, you begin to make some accumulation of information. There are a lot of very positive black curricula that are online. That you only have to look. There's a guy out in California who's learned how to take math and make it's like literally fun. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out there, but you have to do the searching, you know? And that's one of the things I wanted to just re-raise around Malcolm. It's not gonna come to you, you gotta go to it. You know, you've gotta be the aggressor around information. I used to tell students, you can't have a teacher, or you can't predicate your education on a teacher that's gonna like you. Because chances are that a lot of them are not gonna like you. In life, a lot of people are not gonna like you. Is that gonna stop you? Or are you gonna move on? When you go to class, are you prepared? Or are you saying, oh, I don't wanna be bothered with that stuff? I could tell you the students I've seen with books versus the students I've seen with no books. I mean, it's one thing if the school doesn't have it, but the library has them, you know? Or you can put your money together and not have $150 tennis shoes and go get a book. And the 10 of you can share the book. You know, when I was a kid, we used to have school after school. You know, that's how we spent our evenings. And we weren't bright. I'm not a bright kid. You know, the brilliant kids didn't have to do that. You know, but what I'm trying to say is, what do you want out of life? What are you prepared to give to this life in order to get something more positive out of it? Can you see the we in the I, or is everything you do always I, me, my, mine? If that is what you see, that is your worldview. You all right? And there's no one else going to share that world with you. Okay? And so I'm saying that you have to begin to re-educate yourself. That's part of what I was saying about the quest. What are you looking for? What answers do you want? The computer, unlike what we had to go through 9 million books, and one of the things I used to love about SNCC, everybody read. I mean, we were reading in the middle of a demonstration. Did you read this? Do you know about this paragraph? Blah, blah, blah. We're going to see after the demonstration to discuss it. These things are very important. What do you hear on the subways? What do you hear on the buses? What's on people's minds? What's on young people's minds? Who's sleeping with whom, and all kinds of this ridiculous, very low-level conversation. Black people have to take themselves seriously. You take yourself seriously, other people take you seriously too. You know, everybody who's not black is not an enemy. You should know that by now. I mean, we got more sophistication going on here, okay? And then we have to step up to the plate. That's it. I want to thank Herb for coming. Thank you.
What are you reading this summer? Book TV wants to know.